The Trump administration was dealt a setback Thursday after a federal judge ruled a memo sent by the Office of Personnel Management was likely unlawful. The memo in question directed agencies across the federal government to fire probationary employees. U.S. District Judge William Alsup ordered OPM to rescind the memo sent to agencies as the department has no authority to order them to fire people. But in a win for the Trump administration, the judge stopped short of ruling that federal agencies themselves could not continue with the terminations. The ruling comes as the Office of Personnel Management is expected to send a second email to federal employees asking for a bullet point description of what they did in the past week, something Elon Musk teased during Trump's first cabinet meeting this week.
We're going to send another email. Our goal is not to be capricious or unfair. We want to give people every opportunity to send an email.
Joining me now is the Hill's national political reporter and author of the 1230 Report, Cate Martel. Cate, thanks so much for joining us. This second email is expected to be sent out this weekend. How is the administration looking to compel employees to respond?
Well, Judy, it's simple. Employees now have the threat of termination of employment if they don't respond to these emails. Now, prior to yesterday, uncertainty had been the friend of any federal worker that didn't want to respond because there had been competing information coming from the agencies telling them that this was voluntary. Meanwhile, Elon Musk was posting on X that no, it actually was mandatory and was not voluntary. But up until yesterday, when we saw that a cabinet meeting happening with Elon Musk getting prime billing, that shows me that the administration is more on the same page, and now the threat for federal workers is even stronger than it was 24 hours ago.
The National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, also known as NOAA, as you know, has begun the process of laying off probationary workers. How many employees are reported to be let go? What kind of impact could this have, Cate?
Well, Judy, from what we know, there's somewhere between 500 and 2,000 employees that are let go, like you mentioned, probationary workers and new hires. Now, as far as what could be affected, weather forecasts could really be affected because there were a lot of people laid off the National Weather Service. I'm not just talking, rain and chance of sun and temperatures, but when it comes to extreme weather, this actually could really affect the accuracy and the timeliness of some of these forecasts. So it really could have a major effect, Judy.
As President Trump continues his flurry of executive orders, speaking of weather, the president is set to sign a new one that designates English as the official language of the United States. Can you break this down for me?
Yeah, it's actually interesting that in the nearly 250 years the U.S. has been around, there has never been a federal official language. Now, we do know that more than 30 states have designated English as its first language, but this has never been a federal mandate. Now, what this really means practically is that federal agencies are no longer required to provide language assistance to people that don't speak English. So that is, if people are seeking calling a federal number or working with a federal agency and they speak another language, as it stands, these federal agencies are required to help them and provide language assistance. Now, they're still allowed to technically do that, but it's not required.
Thank you, Cate Martel, very much for joining us.
Thanks, Judy.
As the dust settles after a chaotic and 11th hour win for Speaker Mike Johnson, it's more of a starting point to the race as Republicans leaders look to maneuver Trump's agenda through Congress. With the budget resolution passed to the Senate, House GOP leadership now has 2 weeks to avoid a government shutdown. And with a late-night Truth Social post from Trump, it certainly seems like a continuing resolution to keep the government open through September is the winning option for Republicans, with both Johnson and Thune on board to punt government funding until the fall. Joining me now is the Hill's congressional reporter, Mychael Schnell. Mychael, thanks so much for joining us. So let's first recap what's on the table for Congress. We have preventing a government shutdown, avoiding a debt default, raising the debt ceiling, enacting tax cuts, all of this while DOGE is, making its way through Washington like a bull in a china shop. This job for Speaker Johnson just seems to be getting more complicated.
Yeah, that's right. And look, the adopting the budget resolution in the House was a big win for the Speaker. That should not go unseen. It was a huge victory, but like I wrote in The Hill, that's just the beginning of this process. He needed to pass the budget resolution to unlock the budget reconciliation process. Now he's going to have to reconcile the budget resolutions with the Senate. The Senate, of course, passed its own budget resolution that utilizes the two-bill strategy. The House is utilizing the one-bill strategy. Senators, including John Thune, have said that they plan to change the budget resolution. They are going to amend what the House sent over. Well, back in the House, Johnson is saying we want as few changes as possible. And longtime conservatives are saying if this is significantly changed, we are not getting on board. So that is going to be the next issue on reconciliation that Johnson faces. And then third, he actually has to write this package, right? The budget resolution is just the instructions. This is just going to instruct committees do A, B, and C. They actually then need to get it all together, write what's expected to be a very long piece of legislation, and get that over the finish line in the House's razor-thin majority. So again, the budget resolution was a big win, but that is definitely just the start for the reconciliation process. And by the way, in the background, Johnson's going to have to avert a government shutdown. He's going to have to react to the DOJ cuts, which a lot of folks are trying to get codified in law, and whatever the next storm on Capitol Hill that is brewing. So it's going to be a difficult few months for him.
And Senate Majority Leader Thune seems to be placing the blame on Democrats, as the oppositional party often does. Let's take a listen to what he had to say this week.
The Democrats, under Leader Schumer, didn't bring a single appropriation bill to the floor of the United States Senate, and they were available for the last 6 months of last year. So we have a pileup right now created by the Democrats' own making, and now they are publicly talking about shutting the government down. Ironic, I would say.
So, Mychael, is Thune right here? Do Democrats want a shutdown, or are they trying to avoid one just as much as Republicans?
Nobody in Washington ever wants a shutdown. That's always a line that we hear. And you're going to hear this brinkmanship. You're going to hear the blame game is starting. And the answer to it depends on who you ask. You're going to see Democrats say that, Republicans are trying to get different cuts into the legislation, and we don't want to get that in there, so we are holding the line. Republicans are going to be saying, well, Democrats are trying to get language in the legislation that makes sure that Trump actually appropriates the money that is given to him by Congress. So you're going to hear this back and forth. It's going to continue. This always happens when you're up close against the deadline. March 14th, of course, that's the date that Congress is staring down. But there's no true answer to who bears the brunt of this. As always with shutdown showdowns, it's going to depend on who you ask. And this language and this war of words and these back and forths between the two parties are just going to escalate as we get closer to March 14th.
Senators Susan Collins and Senator Patty Murray both said they think they could get this bipartisan funding agreement in place. Are they shooting for the stars here?
Yes, I'm skeptical, to say the least. Essentially what we're talking about here is a top-line number to then begin crafting the 12 appropriations bills that typically fund government. This process, Congress usually can't complete it in a fiscal year itself. It's been, I believe, decades since Congress funded government through these 12 appropriations bills and voted on each one separately. We did see Congress do 2 minibuses last year. But at this juncture, when we are almost in March, that March 14th deadline is looming. The September 30th deadline for the new fiscal year is already approaching. I'm very skeptical that we're going to end up seeing a deal on top-line numbers and getting these 12 appropriations bills over the finish line. As you mentioned at the beginning, President Trump last night endorsed a continuing resolution. That's what I've been hearing from my sources up on Capitol Hill, particularly among House Republicans, that things are moving towards a continuing resolution. That's going to spark some concerns among a number of people. Democrats, for example, think that at this juncture, a full-year continuing resolution, one that ends the fiscal year, could be harmful for some agencies, particularly the Pentagon, because they are going to be dealing with funding that was appropriated from last year, when typically it would be higher this time. And we're going to hear from some defense hawks. So how this gets figured out is still an open question, but it looks like we're trending towards that continuing resolution.
I want to ask you about Senator Bernie Sanders, who's reintroduced his Social Security Expansion Act. Is this a move to kind of needle at President Trump? What's going on with that?
We'll have to see what happens with that. It's certainly an interesting move. As our colleague Hannah Trudeau wrote in The Hill this morning, he's sort of taking on his billionaire basher title once again, which we know Bernie Sanders very well to have that persona, but we're seeing it right now. And I think it's interesting the fact that Trump, who has boasted about his wealth, and Elon Musk boasted about being the wealthiest man in the world, are in such prominent places right now. Perhaps Bernie Sanders sees an opening with those dynamics, and it's going to be interesting to see how he uses that.
Democrats, the Inflation Reduction Act is kind of in the crosshairs of the GOP, but Speaker Johnson has said it looks to take both a scalpel, but also, somewhere
between a scalpel or a sledgehammer.
Yeah, I don't know what that tool looks like.
A lot of leeway.
What kind of instrument that is used for that? But what provisions are Republicans trying to keep?
That's the key question. I can tell you what Republicans are trying to get rid of. I don't know so much of what they want to keep. For example, Chip Roy this week, a very prominent hardline conservative Republican, said he wants to get rid of all of the energy subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act. And of course, that was that massive sweeping healthcare, climate, and tax bill that Democrats had passed when they had the trifecta back in 2022. So now Republicans for a while have been talking about trying to rescind some of those things, those priorities from that bill to try to get revenue, to earn more money for the federal government, to pay for the tax package that they're trying to get over the finish line right now. However, that idea is not unanimous within Republican circles because you have to remember, Judy, there are a bunch of districts across the country that, in fact, actually benefited from the Inflation Reduction Act. Red districts even. Buddy Carter, for example, he's a Republican and in the House, and his district benefits from EV manufacturing. It does EV manufacturing. Republicans are now trying to get rid of some electric vehicle subsidies, tax subsidies. That's something that's not going to go down easily with Buddy Carter. And this issue, this debate, has been brewing in the House for a while. Last year, about 18 House Republicans had written a letter to Speaker Johnson saying, hey, if you're going to try to claw back and if the Inflation Reduction Act, please do so carefully and making sure that you're not hurting Americans and that you're not taking away programs that a lot of folks benefit from. Finally, the rubber is going to be meeting the road right now as Republicans try to craft that Trump agenda bill, and the Energy and Commerce Committee has to find $880 billion in savings. So we're finally going to see that scalpel or that sledgehammer or that amorphous tool in between. We're going to see it actually get to work, and it's going to be fascinating because it's not going to be unanimously approved within the House Republican Conference.
From scalpels to sledgehammers, you got it all covered. Mychael Schnell, thank you so much for joining us. Heightened alert at what some call America's third border, the Florida coast. NewsNation flew alongside the Coast Guard as they target smuggling, drugs, and illegal immigration. Brian Entin joins us now with the latest on these sophisticated operations in the sky.
Obviously, enforcement has increased along the U.S.-Mexico border with President Trump's new policies. But what's interesting is when you go to the Florida Straits, the Atlantic Ocean, the border off the coast of Florida, in some places they have actually seen an increase in migrant activity. And the thought is because security is so tight now on the U.S.-Mexico border, there are now more migrants trying to come through the Atlantic Ocean and into Florida. I rode up with the Coast Guard. I was up in the air with them for 6 hours. Very, very interesting to see, starting in Miami, and then they flew down the coast of Florida, all over the Bahamas and islands out there, areas that are known for migrants to stop over on their way trying to get to the United States. And then we also flew down somewhat close to Cuba looking for migrants. The migrants that they've seen, many come from places not far away, places like Cuba and Haiti, but also far away like China. Florida Congressman Carlos Jimenez says there has been an 8,000% increase in the number of Chinese migrants caught along the Florida coast in just the last couple of months.
I think a lot of Americans think of the border as, U.S.-Mexico. You always see that on TV, but people don't realize this is actually a border too, right out here in the ocean.
Oh, yes, of course. We advise anyone that may think that they would like to enter the U.S. illegally to not take to the seas. Not only are these ventures illegal, but they're also quite dangerous. And please do not trust these transnational organizations. These smugglers, they do not care about you.
And take a look at this. This is video from the U.S. Coast Guard. This actually shows a Chinese man on a paddleboard between the United States and the Bahamas. Bizarre to see this guy just on the paddleboard. He's actually got a suitcase strapped to the paddleboard. This is just one of the migrants that they have found. They say they are increasing these flights like the one that I was on, keeping an eye on exactly what's going on out there. When the Coast Guard sees anything from the sky, they radio down, they send out a cutter, or they send out Border Patrol to go out and investigate. Back to you.
NewsNation's Brian Entin, thank you. Mexico is handing over 29 drug cartel figures to the United States in a surprise extradition, including the infamous drug lord Rafael Caro Quintero. It's the largest handover in years as the Trump administration turns up the heat on drug trafficking organizations. The move comes as President Trump has made threats to impose 25% tariffs on Mexican goods set to take effect on March 4th. Some of the cartel figures handed over were involved in international cocaine and heroin rings decades ago. Others are more recent leaders moving large quantities of fentanyl into the U.S. Kingpin Rafael Caro Quintero was a longtime Drug Enforcement Administration target who's been on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list for decades. Caro Quintero was behind the kidnapping and killing of a U.S. anti-narcotics agent Enrique Kiki Camarena in 1985. The murder was seen as a low point in relations between Mexico and the U.S. The latest extradition marks signs of security cooperation from Mexico. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Judy Kurtz. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.